Christopher Nolan is possibly the most celebrated working director of his generation. If you go around asking normal moviegoers to name their favorite directors, the most common answer is bound to be Nolan. He has reached such a status in Hollywood that he can get essentially anything he wants from studios, and anyone who speaks ill of him on the internet is instantly dogpiled by his fans. He's one of those people you just don't criticize. But what's earned that reputation, and is it really deserved? I've wanted to make a video expressing my thoughts on Christopher Nolan for some time now, and I've even written scripts in the past that have fallen to the back burner, but until recently, there's never seemed to be a great opportunity to make such a video feel relevant to any wider conversation. Then the Odyssey trailer dropped, and man did it kick a hornet's nest. Suddenly the internet became divided between those who value historical accuracy, or even just quality production and costume design, and the Nolan stans who refuse to tolerate such blasphemy against their hero. Now I'll come back to the Odyssey at the end of the video, don't you worry about that, but this controversy got me thinking about Nolan's history and reputation up to this point, so I want to spend most of this video examining his filmography to determine whether or not he deserves the unquestionable praise he's been given, and how we ought to regard him as a filmmaker going forward. But before I get into it, you should know that I'm just thinking out loud, so if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. Now without further ado, let's dive into the strengths and, more importantly for this video, weaknesses of possibly the most successful filmmaker of our time. Let me start this discussion off by making one thing abundantly clear. Christopher Nolan is an incredibly talented filmmaker who makes great movies, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for him. Nothing I'm going to say after this point should be misconstrued as hate against him or his work. With that said, I think the sheer amount of praise he's accumulated has less to do with the actual quality of his movies, and more to do with the kinds of movies he makes. You see, Christopher Nolan is an auteur with a distinct style and uniquely innovative narratives, but his films are also big, widely accessible blockbusters, making him possibly the only intelligent auteur filmmaker most normies who only go to theaters to see big tentpole events will be familiar with. His films aren't necessarily the best, the most innovative, or even the most consistently successful out there, but he does consistently make the biggest blends of blockbuster spectacle and ambitious artistic storytelling, thus earning recognition for his distinct directorial work from a far wider audience than most auteur filmmakers could hope to achieve. Now for the part of the video where things are really going to start getting controversial. Nolan has often been compared to Steven Spielberg, delivering one generational hit after another from almost the beginning of his career and with no sign of stopping. This is certainly a fair comparison in terms of his cultural impact, but in terms of his actual tendencies as a filmmaker and the patterns I see playing out across his career, I think it might be more apt to compare him to M. Night Shyamalan. I know what you're thinking, but hear me out. Obviously, Nolan has a far better track record than Shyamalan. The average quality of Nolan's films is incredible, while the average quality of Shyamalan's is, well, not. Shyamalan, like Nolan, was also once called the new Spielberg, but unlike Nolan, he followed his brief string of successes with a string of abysmal failures, one from which he has never fully recovered beyond mediocrity. So why am I making this comparison? Well, in this video, I will discuss 3 of Nolan's major flaws, 2 of which are also apparent in Shyamalan's work, albeit far more dramatically. The funny thing about these 2 flaws is that they both stem from these filmmakers' greatest strengths. These strengths include 1. Incredibly original concept-driven stories, and 2. A knack for a particular subversive narrative technique. In the case of Shyamalan, this technique is his signature twist endings, and for Nolan, it's nonlinear storytelling. Both filmmakers started off their careers with surprise hits that utilized these skills brilliantly. But as I'm sure you can easily recognize in Shyamalan's filmography, their films became over-reliant on these strengths to the point that they became predictable gimmicks. Outside of The Sixth Sense, Unbreakable, and The Village, most of Shyamalan's twists have either been predictable, stupid, or both, and most of his recent movies have nothing going for them outside of their inherently intriguing premises. Christopher Nolan may not have fallen to nearly the same level in quality and reputation as Shyamalan, but I think we can identify a similar pattern if we look across his career at his biggest films. But before we see how Nolan's strengths have become weaknesses, let's start by briefly looking at one of his first, and in my opinion, strongest films. Memento demonstrates the director's greatest skills being used at their most effective, using an inventive and subversive concept to tell a compelling story, and using a non-linear narrative to make the story into a puzzle that keeps the audience invested and intrigued rather than confused and emotionally detached. The backwards narrative isn't just a gimmick, but an integral part of the story that puts us intimately in the mind of its protagonist, helping us get invested in his story and creating all the narrative suspense and intrigue. And though the plot is told in a complex way, the plot itself is fairly straightforward, making it relatively easy to follow. To this day, I find this film to be Nolan's strongest use of all his best tendencies. However, it's time to look at how each of these tendencies has become a double-edged sword as we move into his more widely successful works. First, let's focus on his concept-driven stories. Many, if not most, of Nolan's films are iconic for their unique ideas that promise an unforgettable and often mind-bending experience. However, he tends to get so caught up in these ideas that he makes two major mistakes. First, many of his movies become so concept-driven that they lack compelling character development or themes. One of the biggest examples of this is Inception, which contains a large ensemble of characters, most of which have absolutely no personality, backstory, or motivations, merely serving as instruments of the plot. You may rebuttal by pointing out Cobb's tragic backstory and Cillian Murphy's relationship with his father, and I won't deny that those are some interesting bits of character development. However, these two characters still don't make up for how obviously paper-thin everyone surrounding them is. And even if they did, their arcs still only exist in service of the plot, rather than the other way around. Cillian Murphy's daddy issues just exist to give the protagonists a way to manipulate him, and Cobb's trauma only exists to add another layer of stakes and tension to the heist by making his subconscious an unpredictable threat. So to be clear, I'm not saying there's no character development in the movie, but it's extremely minimal and virtually entirely in service to the plot. The second issue Nolan's concept-driven stories run into is, I believe, partly the result of the immense trust he's earned from audiences and studios, which leads him to throw caution and restraint to the wind and bite off way more than he can chew. For this, let me turn to Interstellar. Now, I think Interstellar is a top 3 Nolan movie, and most of it is totally solid. However, I don't think it's too controversial to say that the ending gets a bit ridiculous. The idea of future humans having transcended time, giving Cooper a form of time travel to communicate across space and time and ensure the survival of the human race, is incredibly cool. But a bookshelf tesseract inside a black hole letting him manipulate gravity to speak to Murph in her bedroom through Morse code? That's a pretty weird way to execute this concept, and it drops so much new information and wacky ideas onto the audience all at once at the end of an otherwise pretty grounded science fiction story. Now, both examples I just shared are still great movies, and I use them for a reason, since I didn't just want to pick the low-hanging fruit and make it seem like Nolan only makes these mistakes in his worst movies. But I'm sure plenty of you were thinking of Tenet as I talked about each example. I liked the movie when I first saw it because its premise is super cool, but it is easily the worst example in Nolan's filmography of both issues I just discussed, having borderline non-existent characters and a concept that gets so crazy by the end that logic goes out the window and the story becomes impossible to follow. I don't think I need to spend any more time breaking down this film, but suffice it to say, it's the only of Nolan's projects that has caused his fans' trust to waver. Fortunately for him, he followed it up with a massive success, enabling his fans to dismiss it as a fluke rather than examining how it epitomizes issues that have been present in his work from the beginning. The second of Nolan's distinct strengths, his non-linear and otherwise complex storytelling, is possibly the thing his fans love most to celebrate and dissect in his films. However, I fear his love for unconventional narratives has become indulgence in a gimmick, one that hinders rather than defines his films. The first sign of this might have been in Dunkirk, which takes a simple story of survival and makes it unnecessarily hard to follow by telling 3 parallel narratives chronologically out of sync with one another. I won't criticize this decision too much, because I don't know how else Nolan could have told the same story about the same events and characters while maintaining the pacing as he did. But watching this movie, I can't help but feel that Nolan is making his film way more complicated than it has to be, just because he can. However, the film where this really becomes an issue is Oppenheimer. Nolan's first historical biopic was incredibly impressive and very worthy of praise in a great many regards. But I couldn't help but feeling as I was watching it that it had absolutely no good reason to be nearly as convoluted as it was, other than that the director had no interest in telling such a straightforward and potentially boring story, unless he could somehow make the script into a giant puzzle. Telling the story in 3 timelines, with what I'd consider the main linear plot told via flashbacks from 2 different characters at 2 different points in time, did nothing for the story other than make it an absolute chore to follow. This isn't like Memento, where the non-linear narrative puts us in the protagonist's headspace and creates the central mystery. Instead of drawing us into the character's mind, Oppenheimer's narrative framing distances us from the characters because we're bouncing between POVs across decades too often to get easily invested in any one part of the story, and our brains are kept too busy trying to figure out what the heck is going on in each timeline and how they connect for us to allow ourselves to become truly immersed. Before I move on, I want to reiterate that I liked Oppenheimer, maybe even loved it. It gave its subject matter the terrifying weight it deserves. It provided great performances, stunning visuals, and an unforgettable score. And it gave us some of Christopher Nolan's most unique and innovative directing choices. With all that said, I find it one of the best examples I can think of a great director making an otherwise great movie far harder to enjoy than necessary out of pure selfish indulgence without consideration for the story or the audience. And you know what? If you want to argue that there's nothing wrong with that because art is all about freedom of expression and such a talented filmmaker should be able to make whatever kinds of movies he enjoys, I won't challenge you on that. In fact, I kind of agree. But just because Nolan can make whatever kinds of films he wants, doesn't mean those films won't be a lot harder for most people to enjoy. Now that we've covered how Nolan's overindulgence in his strengths becomes a weakness, it's time to dive into the third of his movie's biggest flaws, and the one that I find most prevalent in his work and most concerning for his upcoming project. And while, as I'll explain, I don't find this to be rooted in a strength in quite the same way as the previous 2 skills of his I mentioned, it is also something he is very much known and often praised for. One of the things you'll most often hear Nolan's fans claim is that his films are incredibly grounded in reality. I generally love more grounded films, with worlds that feel tangible, effects that feel practical, and rules and logic that makes the fantastical believable. However, in most of his films, I don't feel that is actually what Nolan does. Rather, in his efforts to be realistic, he tends to make his movies look and feel as plain and unremarkable as possible, both in his visuals and the execution of his concepts. He strips his films of atmosphere and his concepts of everything potentially fantastical about them. Ironically, this attempt to give the appearance of realism often comes at the expense of true realism, and only makes his films visually sterile and leaves his inherently incredible concepts feeling mundane. Let's start by looking at The Dark Knight, which is a particularly interesting example because it is a sequel to a movie that is incredibly visually distinct and unafraid of its comic book influences. That movie makes Batman feel like the boogeyman he is, a literal ninja who uses stealth and theatrics to terrify his prey, and its Gotham is drenched in atmosphere. However, for whatever reason, by the time of The Dark Knight, Nolan seems to have become ashamed to be making comic book movies, and does everything he can to steer the sequel away from its source material, leaving a Batman who feels more like James Bond in a black battlesuit, and a Gotham that looks like any other US city filmed on an iPhone. None of this really makes the film as a whole a lot more realistic than its predecessor, but I guess it's supposed to look more realistic. Comparing these 2 Batman films proves that their director deliberately chooses to do this rather than being incapable of doing otherwise, and thus, it makes me a lot more frustrated than if artistic visuals and fantastical stories just weren't among his strengths. However, one of the worst examples of this for me might be Inception. I know, I'm trashing on one of Nolan's most loved movies a lot in this video. The thing is, there's so much you could do with the concept of invading people's dreams to steal or implant ideas. Dreams are about the most fantastical setting you could imagine, and yet this film is somehow one of Nolan's most grounded looking. The incredible potential of this intriguing concept feels totally wasted with only the most safe and unremarkable set pieces and action sequences possible. In a world where you should be able to do literally anything imaginable, the action scenes consist of a car chase, a fistfight in a hotel, and an assault on a mountain fortress while skiing, which sounds kind of interesting until you realize that's a ripoff of a scene from a James Bond movie. There is absolutely nothing particularly fantastical or visually memorable in any of the sequences of this movie, outside of Cobb's introduction of the audience insert character to the dream world, and even that scene was replicated way more memorably in Doctor Strange. I mean, come on. At one point, Tom Hardy tells Joseph Gordon-Levitt to dream a little bigger, and instead of summoning a dragon or something, he just pulls out a rocket launcher. And besides how unfantastical the content of the dreams themselves are, Nolan over-explains and oversimplifies such a potentially imaginative and creatively liberating concept to the point that he makes it feel somehow boring and predictable. Of course, not all of his films suffer from this problem. One of the reasons I like Interstellar as much as I do is that it's unafraid to make the most of its premise and showcase some truly stunning visuals and exotic locations. And as much as I criticize its ending, I'd rather films take such ambitious leaps as Interstellar than play it as safe as Inception, so it may seem Nolan learned from and overcame this shortcoming. However, his most recently released film reveals that this is an issue that persists beyond his inherently fantastical films. Yes, I said Oppenheimer was visually stunning. There is just one exception to that statement, and unfortunately, it was probably the most important scene to visually pull off. I am, of course, talking about the Trinity Test. In a movie about the invention of the atomic bomb, the one scene where we see a bomb go off is a pretty big deal, and everything about the scene is incredible, except the bomb itself. This may seem like a silly little thing for me to be mentioning in a video about the weaknesses that persist across Nolan's movies, but I mention it because it seems to be a strange symptom of his dedication to the appearance of realism. If you don't know, he set off a real gas explosion to stand in for the nuke, rather than do it as a visual effect, as if so he could flex that we did the nuke for real. The thing is, a gas explosion is not a nuke. It looks nothing like a nuke, and doesn't have anywhere near the feeling of sheer power a nuke should convey. And thus the scene in the film is incredibly underwhelming, utterly failing to offer the sense of awe and terror it should. And if Nolan had just put a fraction of the effort into his visuals here as he did in Interstellar, he could have had a spectacular sequence. What we got looks real, which I assume is what Nolan wanted, but it doesn't look realistic. And in this case, a realistic nuke would have looked way better and been far more effective than the real one. And this is the issue with what we've seen of the Odyssey. Nolan stands claim they don't care if it's historically inaccurate, but historical inaccuracy isn't necessarily the real issue. If the film still felt real and looked cooler than if it were historically accurate, then, while I personally would still be annoyed about it, I wouldn't make such a big deal out of it or hold it against Nolan. The real issue is that he seemingly wanted it to look as grounded as possible, which entailed making the costumes as plain and boring as he could, with a muted brown color palette and the generic, vaguely Greek aesthetics most audiences would initially expect from a film in this setting. In other words, he wanted people to look at it and think it looked real, not realistic, despite the fact, and perhaps even partly because of the fact, that a realistic version of the story would look way cooler. Like with the Dark Knight setting, Inception's dream sequences, and Oppenheimer's bomb scene, it seems Nolan thought the realistic version of the story would be too cinematic, too fantastical, too unique and impactful for audiences to think it was real. And so he instead deliberately went with the most visually unimpressive and uninspired version of the film possible. Sure, it looks like the first thing AI might generate if told to imagine the Odyssey, but hey, at least it doesn't risk anyone questioning how grounded it is. I don't know if the Odyssey as a whole will be good or bad. In fact, I expect it to be a mostly great adaptation of the story. However, this crippling tendency to put the superficial semblance of reality over actual realism is keeping Nolan from making nearly as visually stunning and immersive a film as he could. Now, I didn't mention every issue I have with Nolan's films. I could also go on for a bit about his tendency to get a bit pretentious, attempting some semblance of thematic depth with monologues that sound profound on the surface but make no real sense upon analysis, such as Gordon's final monologue at the end of The Dark Knight, or Anne Hathaway's speech about love in Interstellar. However, my intention with this video was not to pick apart every little thing that bugs me across all of his work. As I started this analysis by clarifying, I have tremendous respect for Christopher Nolan, and his resume is impressive. There is very good reason that he is as well regarded in the industry as he is, and I won't argue with those who consider him among the most ambitious and talented filmmakers working today. And of course, I certainly don't have any issue with people loving his movies. Heck, I like just about all of them and absolutely love some of them. I just felt the need to make this video because, with his next film coming out and many people expressing their disappointment with what they've seen, his fans have been acting as if he is beyond criticism and treating any doubts of his perfection as blasphemy. Thus, I felt the need to share my few issues with the work of this incredible artist to justify my worries for his upcoming project. But with everything I've just said, what do you think about Christopher Nolan as a filmmaker? Does he deserve the treatment he's received? Why or why not? What are your favorite or least favorite of his tendencies? What are your favorite or least favorite of his films? I'm just here to kick off the discussion, so please join in the conversation in the comments below. I look forward to seeing you there, and until next time, just keep thinking out loud.